Okay, folks, if you're on YouTube, you're behind the scenes with yours truly and Cal Fussman. We're getting ready to go live here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bright Spots in Healthcare. This is Eric Glazer, and we have a very special episode for you today. And as such, we are going to organize it a little differently. Over the years, we've covered a lot of topics tied to connecting with the consumer around engagement, experience, trust, inclusion. These are all obviously really important parts of health plan and provider strategies. But what is the key component to doing it all successfully? How is our brain as human beings built so that we could better recall something or be inspired to do something? I will tell you what you all probably know. Human beings learn best via stories. And although this is common sense, we as individuals, and certainly we as companies, need to become better storytellers. And we need to mute.
Because I walk on different streets.
We need to mute someone. Sorry about that, guys. So the better we become at storytelling, the more success we're going to have activating and engaging your members, your patients. Your star ratings are going to go up, your HEDIS and CAP scores, they're going to go up. Your claims for your commercial population and your Caden care populations are going to go down. So this is what we're going to do. Today, I have brought in one of the most preeminent storytellers of our time. If you have not heard of our guest, Cal Fussman, I encourage you to Google him or listen to his own podcast entitled Big Questions with Cal Fussman. Cal is a New York Times bestselling author. Magazine lovers may recognize him as the writer who spent a week with Muhammad Ali for an Esquire magazine cover story. He has interviewed Mikhail Gorbachev, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, Robert De Niro, and hundreds of others who have shaped the last half century. I can go on and on. One of his last episodes on his podcast to drop was with Matthew McConaughey, which was simply terrific. I encourage you to check that episode out. Just check out his entire podcast, Big Questions with Cal Fussman, to hear all of that firsthand. I brought Cal on today. Welcome, Cal, by the way.
Thanks. That was an introduction.
It's great to have you here. I brought Cal on today because I think we need more experts like Cal Fussman in healthcare. We need to listen and learn and then listen again to people like Cal. And this is going to enable all of us to broaden our horizons and continue to create new bright spots in healthcare. So for this episode, especially, if you are enjoying it, if you think it's valuable, send it to your boss and colleagues. Take notes, send it via email, your notes. Use this episode to begin to change the culture and how you think about engagement at your organization. I think it's going to be incredibly enlightening and a lot of fun. So Cal, I want to start because I teased you up with all of the cool and popular celebrities that you have interviewed and met. So tell us a little bit about these folks and how your storytelling through meeting all of them has evolved over the years.
Well, it's actually interesting when I look back at it, and it touches upon healthcare in a crazy way. I learned to interview while I was traveling around the world for about 10 years without a home. I would get on buses and trains and look for an empty seat. There was a good reason for that, because basically I had very little money and I needed to sit next to somebody that I could start a conversation with so that at the end of the ride, they might invite me home or invite me for dinner. And quite often, people did invite me for dinner, and it turned into a party. And all the people at the party then invited me to visit their house. And then they said, oh, you got to see my cousin 2 hours from here. And I literally got passed around the world that way. And I went to journalism school at the University of Missouri, worked for newspapers like the Miami Herald and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. But it was really this trip around the world that taught me how to connect with people. Because again, remember, if you're in the middle of Hungary, the person next to you probably wasn't, especially back in like the beginning of the 80s, they didn't really speak much English, and you were gesticulating, whatever way you could get across your message. And after 10 years of that, I got really good. But in the middle, I realized I was in places like remote regions of the Sahara Desert. And if something happened to me, I needed to do like immediate emergency care, I needed to know what to do. So I would come back to the United States, visit my family. And I said, you know what, I'm going to take a class to be an emergency medical technician. This way, I'll just know if something comes up and I'm in the middle of the desert or the forest, I'll know what to do. And I took the class and I loved it. And I wasn't thinking of riding on an ambulance, but just when I graduated, the emergency room at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis called up the school and they said, do you have any like recent grads who might want to work in the emergency room? And the instructor said, I got just the guy for you. And they sent me over. And I spent a while in the emergency room as an emergency room technician, and I loved it. I did it for a little while because the purpose was for me to get back on the road again. But that spot in my heart for healthcare was always there. And when I got back from traveling around the world, started to work for Esquire magazine, and they had a column called What I've Learned, which is wisdom in the words of people who lived extraordinary lives. And I was so suited to this column because I would show up to meet Mikhail Gorbachev or Muhammad Ali or Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson or George Clooney in a very different way than all the other journalists. Because for me, I'd sit down next to them. It was like they were sitting next to me on the bus or the train. And I needed to figure out a way to get them to invite me home, which in this case meant I needed to find a way to connect with them enough to share their lives. And I became the principal columnist. I did this for, almost 20 years and spoke with hundreds of icons, presidents, and all of the celebrities in movies. And not only that, but, the folks who invented the internet. Also spoke with Dr. Michael DeBakey, one of the creators of open heart surgery. So I got a chance to meet all people who shaped the world over the last 75 years. And that is pretty much how things were until the last few years, when I was asked to speak about all these conversations I had with some of the world's greatest people. And that actually took me to companies and actually back to hospitals and to hospital associations. And so my thinking about healthcare, which had just been set off way back 30 years ago, was reignited. And here we are today.
So before I want to go there, because and you have an incredible story, and like many, you also have a powerful story as a caregiver too. Tell us before we leave this, like, I'm curious, and I certainly want some of our audience to learn, like, tell us about some of the most memorable interviews had, and maybe a little bit about those and what made your sort of your bus experience. Let's hear firsthand how that was applied and connecting with some of these interesting personalities that have influenced sort of our society. Okay, let's start with Gorbachev, because I know that story a little bit, and I think it's incredibly interesting.
It's a great example of storytelling as well. So let me take you back to February 2008, New Orleans. Mikhail Gorbachev is in town to give a speech about abolishing nuclear weapons. This is like years after he was the leader of the Soviet Union. I'm sitting in a hotel lobby waiting to meet him. I got an hour and a half to ask him any question I want to fill up Esquire's When I Learn column. I'm well prepared, done all my research, ready to go. Phone rings. It's the publicist. Cal, sorry to tell you this, but your interview with Mr. Gorbachev is going to have to be cut short. Now I'm concerned. And why am I concerned? Because this column that I wrote, What I've Learned, was not in my words. It was all in Gorbachev's words. It was what he learned, what the subject learned. So there's no way for me to fluff this up or fill it out. I need like at least an hour to be able to reach into his soul and extract the wisdom that he's accumulated in his life, at the least 45 minutes. So I'm on the phone, I'm saying, well, how much time have I got? 10 minutes. 10 minutes? I can't make this work in 10 minutes. That's impossible. You promised 10 minutes. Cal. A lot of very important people have been added to the list to see Mr. Gorbachev. There's nothing I can do about it. You want the time or not? Well, of course I take the time, but as I hang up the phone, I'm feeling worse and worse and worse about it. Because I know I'm gonna walk in that room, we're gonna shake hands, we're gonna exchange pleasantries, we're gonna be seated, and that's 2 minutes right there. Plus, my questions gotta be translated into Russian, and his answers back to English. So that's another 2 minutes right there. And this interview is down to 6 minutes before it even starts. Hey, you can only do your best, right? So the appointed time, publicist escorts me into this conference room, and like, there he is, Gorby. I look over there and smile. He looked a little older than I remembered. He was about 77 at the time, but at first glance, I knew he's just expecting my first question to be about nuclear weapons, Ronald Reagan, or world events. And so I look right into his eyes and I say, what's the best lesson your father ever taught you? And he is surprised. Doesn't say anything. He looks up, he's searching. And then it's almost as if he can see a movie of his childhood playing on the ceiling. And he starts to tell me his story about when he was a boy. And his dad got called up to fight in World War II. Now, Gorbachev's lived on a farm. So he's recalling the trip that the family took from the farm to this town to see the dad off. And as he's describing this journey, he's including all these little details, and I can't believe it. Like, this is fantastic. I've done this research. I never saw this story. And I'm literally transfixed when I am gripped inside by a terrible thought that screams, wrong question. This interview is going to be over before the Gorbachevs even get to town. But they do get to town. And when they do, Mr. Gorbachev takes everybody into a little shop and he gets them ice cream. And Gorbachev is remembering this ice cream. He's remembering the aluminum cup that it was served in. He's talking about this ice cream as if it was in the palm of his hand. And as he's talking about this ice cream, it's as if we both have this thought that, oh my God, this cup of ice cream is the reason he was able to make peace with Ronald Reagan and end the Cold War. Because this cup of ice cream contained the memory of what it was like just before his dad went to war, the dread of not knowing if he'd ever see his father again. So he's looking at this ice cream. I'm looking at the ice cream. He's looking at the ice cream. I'm looking at this ice cream. We look up at each other and we're thinking, man, this is deep. Just then, knock on the door. It's the publicist. Mr. Gorbachev, time for the interview. We'll have to conclude. Gorbachev looks at her, looks at the interpreter, looks at me and says, no, I want to talk to him. Publicist taken aback and leaves the room. Conversation continues, goes deeper. 10 minutes later, another knock on the door. This time the publicist comes in a little more sheepishly. Mr. Gorbachev, Cal, time. And Gorbachev says, no, I want to talk to him. Publicist leaves the room. Conversation continues, goes deeper. 10 minutes later, another knock on the door. And this time the publicist is in a full out panic, Eric. I'm telling you, like, Mr. Gorbachev, Cal, please, this day was planned by the minute. We're never going to get through it on time. There's a long line of people out the door. The mayor's out there waiting to see Mr. Gorbachev. Please. And Gorbachev looks at me with this shrug that says, hey, what can I do? So we both laughed. The interview concluded. I got the material to fill out the column. It was a huge success. When I thought back on why, I realized if I hadn't asked that first question, I never would have gotten that insight. If I'd have gone in and asked a canned question, I would have gotten a canned answer. The interview would have been over in 6 minutes, and I never would have known what was possible. So let's just sum it up with how this plays into storytelling. When I asked that question to him, what is the best lesson your father ever taught you? I was telling a story. The story I was telling was, this conversation is going to be different from every other conversation you're going to have today. Every other interview is going to be around the same subject. You're going to get the same questions. This conversation is going to make you stop and think. And his response to that story was to tell his own story. And in the exchange of those stories, we had a connection that led to success. And basically, everything we're going to talk about, you can trace straight back to that half an hour, 40 minutes of my time with Gorbachev, because I'm applying the same principles to everything that I would like to see done in healthcare.
And I know, as anyone who goes through their journey in life, you're going to always have points in your life where healthcare and you face healthcare from the front row or actually from the bed. To tell us a little bit about your relationship with Larry King and how that recently gave you a foray into healthcare. And then we'll get into some more healthcare specific questions, but I think this will be interesting to learn more about.
Yeah, it's sort of a seamless connection, because around the time that I was interviewing Gorbachev and Ali, I went off to interview Larry King to find out what he learned about living an extraordinary life. And we hit it off immediately. It was just, it's really hard to describe, but we were so close in the first hour we met that after the story was published, we kept in touch, and I was 3,000 miles away, so I wasn't seeing him every day. But what happened is when it came time for him to write his soup to nuts autobiography, he remembered me. And so we got together and I helped him write My Remarkable Journey. And in doing so, I moved out to LA, and he said, meet me at Nate Now's, which is a breakfast joint in Beverly Hills. Deli, been around for decades. And every morning I would go to breakfast with him and his buddies. They were all like in their 70s at the time. And after breakfast, we would have such a great time during breakfast that when the book ended, I was a regular at the table. And for the next 12 years, that started in 2008 up until COVID, I basically had breakfast with Larry almost every day that we were both in Los Angeles. And so we became very close. And toward the end of his life, like what happened is all of the guys at the table who were 75 when I came started to get older, and one had a stroke at the table, and I got him over to a doctor. It was amazing. His name was Sid, one of Larry's closest friends from childhood. And I literally, Sid couldn't believe he was having a stroke and he wanted to drive. And I had to yank the keys out of his hands and get him to the doctor. And Larry's friends started to pass away. And then Larry got sick. And in the last 2 years of his life, from like 19 and 20, he was in the hospital a lot. And I would go like whenever I could to be with him. And so I got a chance to understand what it's like actually to see great care given. He had so many problems and they kept him going, and he did not want to die. He had an indestructible will to live. And so I felt, again, for the people who were caring for him. And then what happened is COVID hit, and my dad was turning 90. And so he was alone on the other side of the country. And I said, oh, I got to be with my dad. And I spent a year, the last year of my dad's life, with him and caretaking and learning what it's like to care for the elderly. And so while I am certainly not any kind of expert in healthcare in terms of being on the job for a decade or 2 decades, but I have been in the hospitals. I do know what it's like to see my dad get home from the rehab center after he fell in a wheelchair for the first time, and have him turn to me and say, I got to go to the bathroom, and start wheeling him toward the bathroom, and have him turn to me saying, I got to go right now, and speeding up and reaching the place where the wheelchair wouldn't fit through the bathroom door. Now, why wouldn't that happen? And I start to talk to people, and I realize that you need like a 36-inch wide door to get a wheelchair through. And a lot of houses don't have that. And God bless you.
Thank you.
And so it's making me curious about a lot of things. And my podcast veered toward healthcare. And that's when I found out what was going on from like a helicopter view. Because people who were focused on the future, people that the Pope hires to tell the Pope what's going to happen in the next 10 years. A guy named Jay Sammet was telling me, well, Cal, in the next 10 years, you're going to be seeing the silver tsunami. I had never heard that word, those words. And he said, in the next 10 years, America, for the first time, is going to become an older country than a younger. And not only that, but 110, 120,000 doctors, physicians are going to retire. And we're not prepared. And I started to imagine what it's going to be like because we're going to need so much extra care for the elderly. And you're going to have such a stress level on the people in the middle who are like 50, because they're going to have to be taking care of these people if they're not sent off to homes, while at the same time, they're going to be trying to take care of teenage kids.
Let's try to talk about application here, because I thought it was really interesting when you said during your rendition of your engagement with Mikhail Gorbachev that your question was telling him a story, like almost like this subtle talk. And so I'm curious how we could apply. That's a pretty sophisticated way of thinking, of you're asking a question, and in doing so, it's telling your audience a story. Could you provide sort of an example of how that is being applied or can be applied in business? If you could apply it to healthcare, great. If you apply it to another organization that you've worked with, great. But how could you use your questions to tell your audience a story?
Okay, here's a way that I often used when interviewing celebrities who they're constantly being interviewed, and many feel like they're in a position where if you're launching a movie, you've signed with the studio, you've got to do the publicity. And so it's set up for somebody from the magazines to come and interview you. And yet you don't really want your life exposed. You've just signed to publicize a movie. But the reality is the writer coming in is looking to expose your life, and they don't want that to happen. So they can be quite reticent. And so what I would do, and I'm quickly thinking how this would apply to business, but I just say I'm interviewing Robert De Niro. What I would do is say, Al Pacino told me this story. And then I would go into this great story that Al Pacino told me and finish it with a question. And what that did is it put a bar for anyone who's competitive to say, oh, Al told you that story? Okay, here, I'm going to top that. And there are ways that you can use that tactic in any level, simply by playing off the competitive nature. If you know somebody's going to be competitive, all you've got to do is look at the people that are being competed against, find something that the competition came up with, and then ask a question that asks the person to top it.
What about, so I know when we were sort of prepping for this interview, we talked a little bit about the trend in healthcare around localism and how important local healthcare is for all kinds of reasons, especially building trust and with your community and the folks in it. Are there things around questions and or initiatives that allow an organization to tell a story without even telling the story? I guess is my way of saying it, getting back to the sort of how you did it with Gorbachev, that maybe you've been looking at or even have been part of, or at least been looking at as far as healthcare goes.
Absolutely. And I can remember while I was taking care of my dad, I was meeting a lot of nurses and talking to them about healthcare, and finding out that they're in a well-known hospital there was a real long delay in seeing patients who had mental health problems. And I thought about it, and I could certainly understand. It's during the time of COVID. We were all knocked off balance mentally. But I remember going on the internet and seeing a headline that basically said, you need therapy? You need to see a professional? Come into Walmart, like $1 a minute. Now, think of the story that tells. You can't get anybody to see you or to listen to you. Hey, we're here for you. Come on in. And they're telling you the price of $1 a minute. You can book it. You got 15 minutes to get off your chest. Yeah, I got $15. That's an amazing story for that company to tell, because it's saying we care about our customers. Simple as that. And you know what? Amazon is kind of doing the same thing as they roll out their like pharmacy now. I saw a headline on, it might have been an email that Amazon was sending out, said, Prime members, if you're a member of Amazon Prime, get select meds for as low as $1 per month. Save time, save money, stay healthy. Now, think about the story that's telling. For as you can't get lower than $1. For as low as $1 a month, we're going to put you in a place where all you got to do is click that button and medicines are going to come to you with no problems. You know our history. We're going to get it to you. And it's a story they're telling. And if you are competing against that, you got to figure out a way to tell your own story to the locals that you're interacting with, or else your connection may get severed. It's just as simple as that, Eric.
Let's try to break it down for everyone, because I think there's some subtle sophistications to executing this well. Can we, like, what do we need? Let's create a blueprint here for everyone. So what do you need to tell a great story? And I guess let me actually, what do you need to prompt a great story first? What questions do you need to ask to be able to prompt a great story?
Well, here's the beauty in this for healthcare. This is the most amazing part of it for anybody's working in healthcare, is that all stories, all great stories, start with vulnerability. If a story doesn't have vulnerability in it, nobody's going to pay attention. The vulnerability of the main character is what allows us as the audience to step into those shoes. And here's the beauty, Eric. Every story in healthcare is filled with vulnerability. There is not one place in healthcare where you see no vulnerability. People go in to see a doctor, to get help in a hospital because they're vulnerable. And so you have a treasure trove of stories in healthcare. So there's a basic format, and I guarantee you, if I say to you, okay, we're going to talk some movies here. I'm going to give you a format, and I'm 100% positive that you're going to pick out your favorite movie, and you're going to follow this format through to the end. It's going to start with a vulnerable situation, character in a place where they're in trouble of sorts. And they're going to have an intention to get out of trouble. They want to get to a better place. They want to go someplace new. It could be physically, it could be internally, but they have an intention to get past this vulnerability. Next, you're going to see obstacles come. And those obstacles are going to make the audience lean in, because now they're in the shoes of this vulnerable character, and the obstacle is coming at them too. At that point, quite often, you see a mentor figure show up to help the vulnerable character. And the mentor character will offer some kind of advice or help, and vulnerable character will take it or not take it and need to learn that he or she needs to take it because they confront more obstacles. And now you're very invested in this character. And ultimately, as this journey continues, it's called the hero's journey, the vulnerable character will transform. And that's generally the end of the movie. They'll get past the final obstacle and they will be in a different place than they were at the start. Now, you could plug that into any medical setting because that's what medicine does. And the mentor character can be a physician, can be a nurse, can be a hospital, can be equipment, as long as it's helping the vulnerable character make that transformation. So that's the beauty of this and the sadness of it, because as when it comes to storytelling, for whatever reason, and I'll throw it at you, I know HIPAA laws people like to throw up, but healthcare, I don't know why, just does not seem to want to embrace storytelling to get its message across.
I know you're working with healthcare organizations and have gone on site and done workshops. Is there a particular organization, you don't have to name names, but just that has taken some of the principles that you preach and are and applied them particularly well? And if there's an example of a story that has resonated with their market, maybe share it or how it came about.
Well, to show you where things tend to be at, what a primitive level. And there was a very smart CEO at hospital, Kaiser Permanente Hospital, who wanted to get everyone in his hospital to understand the stories that were going on. So I was brought in and I was moved around the hospital where I could find these stories, that great stories that were happening. And then for 2 days, I gave 3 talks so that everybody in the hospital could find out about the amazing things that were going on in the hospital that they didn't know about. They were working there and they didn't know about it. So that's kind of the starting point. Now, like last week, I spoke to a group of physicians at a hospital in Colorado, and it's very clear to all of them, especially when they're in situations where they have to give bad news. You've got cancer. Every physician who has to say that will tell you that the moment those words leave her or his mouth, the patient goes to another place. There is a severing there inside. They what does this mean? What does it mean for my kids? How am I going to tell my parents? And at that moment, it's so clear that the physician has to tell a story to reconnect. Because if the physician, and this happens so often, if the physician starts talking about studies and numbers, you're going to see the patient with the glazed eyes, and they all get it. The patient's just nodding up, yeah, and they ain't hearing nothing. And so it's a tremendous waste of time for the physician, actually. Once they lose that connection, for them to be talking about studies and what's going to happen when the patient really isn't paying attention, it's just lost time. Then the patient leaves and then comes back to reality and is then ready to ask the questions that the doctor just answered. So again, this is a huge time-saving device to tell a short story, a very short story that will connect the patient to another human. Because as you said before, and I use the example from a book called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, written by bestselling author Yuval Noah Harari. He starts the book with the sentence, "Humans think in stories rather than in facts, numbers, or equations. And the shorter the story, the better." That's the first sentence. That's his theme. And we have a system where I'm told, again, I get this information from other people who are in healthcare, but I'm told that basically a patient walks out of the office grasping 20% of what the doctor told them. And there's got to be better ways to get that messaging across. And so by simply thinking about your stories, you enable yourself to reach out to the locals around you that you want as customers. You're going to be, it's sticky. They remember you because they remember the story. The survey number is not sticky. The study is not sticky. But I'll give you an example. And I talked to one of the doctors at this hospital in Colorado who said, one of the things I've done is I've had patients who survived cancer. And I've asked them, is it okay when I get a patient who seems a little lost, who is in the same situation, can I have them call you? And you know what? He said, 99 times out of 100, the person will say absolutely. And it will be part of their healing process to help tell their story. Patients want to tell their stories. And I think healthcare is just going to have to step up and be willing to tell its story for another reason. And everybody is aware of this whole idea of persuasion, of telling people who don't want to get vaccinated, don't want to wear masks, telling them a story that is not going to be offensive to them, but it's going to get the point across because we have this huge divide. So when you think of the time saved, when you think of the ability to persuade, and when you think of the creativity that comes through this task, it's just a win-win-win for anybody who wants to endorse it.
So some of the, I'm taking notes here, and I like the fact, all stories start with vulnerabilities. That's probably the big quote from the show so far. Can I see it? You gave us a couple of tactics at the very beginning of our conversation about asking. You said, you didn't say these, but I'm just taking them from the lesson you just taught us. Ask different questions, make them personal, so that it can inspire or prompt a story. And so I'm curious, as we're thinking about all the things that you're talking about around healthcare and how we can become better storytellers. before we further on in some of the things we should be doing, I'd like to talk about a couple of things we shouldn't be doing, because my guess is that's going to be a quick fix for a lot of us. What are some of the questions? It doesn't have to be healthcare specific. In fact, I prefer it not be. Let's pull ourselves back out to sort of some of your core guests over the past half century. What are some of the biggest bomb questions you've had and what you've learned from them?
So questions you shouldn't ask?
Yeah, like questions that have bombed that you've learned, and so that we could avoid asking them sort of in our industry in the way that we would have to. Like, what are some things we should look away from?
Okay, again, it depends on the situation, but I never ask a close-ended question. I do not ask a question that starts with like, do you think? And it can be answered in a yes or a no. Because again, I'm using questions to connect with people. I'm not using questions to be cut off from people. And when you ask a yes or a no question, you're basically putting yourself in the situation to get a very short answer and one that doesn't reveal any information. But if you ask why, hey, you look at Simon Sinek. The guy did a short YouTube video just about asking the question why, and he got millions and millions of people listening to it. It's genius. It's one word. It's Larry King's favorite question. Why? You can also ask how. These questions, like if you ask somebody how, think about that. You are saying to them, you know what? It sounds to me like you're an expert of sorts. How did you do it? And so it's just simply by your inflection and the use of the word how, you're actually flattering somebody. How'd you get that done?
Yeah.
And so that's just a very simple way to look at questions in terms of accentuating the positive, the bright spots. How'd you do it? Why'd you do it? Even if you didn't like what they did, why? Why? Let them explain themselves. And if it turns out that what they did wasn't really good, then, well, maybe they're going to learn something from the answer.
Right.
Whereas if you're getting into this yes and no business, I mean, that's like what lawyers do in a courtroom to basically just hone in on a case and not allow the jury to hear any of the gray. It's just black and white. This is what happened, when we all know that there's a lot of gray in the world.
We were talking, I'm wondering how we could move this forward. So we were talking a bit off, I want to say off camera. I guess it was off camera since we're on camera, but about a little bit about how we could start thinking about pushing this whole mission of better storytelling and better communicating and asking better questions into healthcare together, maybe through a podcast. To tell everyone a little bit about it, and let's see where it goes and if we can get people involved.
Well, I was fascinated where you took it because you have a great audience and it's an audience of people who are doing things in healthcare. And maybe they have problems that they would like to try and solve with storytelling. So basically, as I said to you yesterday, what if we just had some fun and we asked them to write in with problems that they have or questions about how storytelling might solve a specific issue. And I said, well, we'll take the best one and I'll come in and I'll do it for free. We'll do it for free because you're the person who actually understands what is going on overall. I find stories and tell stories. I say it, even though if you go on my podcast, you'll see I had to talk to Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, and a lot of people
And
that
it's
are involved in
not-
healthcare. But what we're getting at here is you have an audience of people who do. And so if they want to learn how storytelling can help them, just let them reach out to you, and you can figure out the one that most stands out to you. And Eric, you then call me up and say, okay, Cal, here's the issue that I'd like to see solved. Let me see how you do it. And I think that's pretty much what came out of the conversation.
Well, let's do this real quick, and then I want you to continue with your thoughts. Sherry, if you don't mind, why don't we put a quick poll for those watching this live via webinar? But if you're listening to it by way of the podcast feed, I think the easiest way to do this is just to email me directly. And it's eglazer@sharedpurposeconnect.com. Gosh knows you've probably received enough emails from me. So just shoot me a quick email and just put like Cal in the subject line, and we'll get back to you immediately. So let's do it that way. But continue on, Cal. I don't know if I cut you off. You had any additional thoughts on that?
I thought it was just, you led me to like a great place, because I think you're going to be able to look at whatever responses you got to that query, and you're going to say, you know what, Cal, this is an interesting topic. This is something that I'm seeing is happening across the board. It needs to be addressed. Let's see what you can do with this. And I'm happy to jump in and just see where it takes us.
That's great. Now, that'll be super fun if it works out. I love it. It was sort of, we were shooting from the hip on, and I think it would be a lot of fun for everyone involved, and hopefully productive too, right? We want to create more bright spots in healthcare, not so much for the podcast itself, although that's great, but certainly for the organizations who would be applying it for, because there's consumers or patients on the other end of that. Any other final thoughts, Cal, on our advice and guidance? If there's any other final stories you want to share with us that you think can inspire us, doesn't have to be a healthcare story, from all your experiences that we could walk away with.
Well, I really would like to address, and then let me know if I'm pounding on this same drum a little too much, but the idea of like so much of the country not being vaccinated, it to me is an example of terrible storytelling. Okay, and I'll just start this from the very root of it. If you, for your own reasons of curiosity, there are a lot of people who don't like vaccinations, and you know what? In this case, if I'm one of those people and I hear that they've just created Operation Warp Speed to deliver this vaccine to me, it might give me pause. It might make all of the things that I am intuiting, like this is too fast, there's no proof, I don't know, what is this? What can this do 5 years from now? If my 20-year-old daughter takes it, will it sterilize her? I don't know. And what research do they have to prove it? It's only been a year and a half since this virus appeared. Okay, so just calling it Operation Warp Speed, bad storytelling from the start. Now, if you want to reach that segment of the population that sees itself as very patriotic and feels that their liberties are being encroached upon, well, you know what could have been done is the story could have been told from the point of view of George Washington back when they were fighting the Revolutionary War in 1777, and smallpox was ravaging his army, and they lost the Battle of Quebec. And Washington basically said, we're going to have to inoculate our troops against smallpox. And they did. And well, the rest is history. They won. The fact is that from what I read, 2 to 3% of those who were inoculated actually died. But when you look at the big picture, you had somebody who was running the military who basically said, in order to survive as a nation, we need to inoculate the troops. And this is what I'm talking about. If you're getting out the story that way, it's not seen by patriots as they're being told that they have to do something, and that people who don't have the same political beliefs are forcing this upon them. You're just saying this is what we did in the past and what worked. And this is patriotic. This is protecting your countrymen. So I would just encourage people to look for really the bright spots in storytelling so that they can use them to be persuasive, because from what I'm getting, talking to people in healthcare, there's a lot of people just throwing their hands up in the air or actually leaving their jobs because of this frustration. And a lot of it could have been done differently to the right storytelling that brought us together.
Amen. I have to tell you too, as someone who's been in the industry for a long time, I do think sometimes the best innovation and changes come from people with completely no experience, with a completely fresh perspective that often drives, I think, really meaningful, innovative ideas. I hope this isn't the last time we talk. I want to do this little, whatever we're going to call it. I don't know what we're going to call it, but this old storytelling journey or mission that we could go on.
Bright spots in storytelling.
There you go. That's it. Bright spots in storytelling and healthcare, consistent with the brand. I thank you for doing this. Thank you for all the preparation you took and spending time with me and doing the show. For those of you, again, who are listening that want to have a chance just to connect with Cal directly, email me at eglazer@sharedpurposeconnect.com. Thanks for all of you listening. Again, if you haven't subscribed to Bright Spots in Healthcare, I don't know what you're waiting for. Just click on the subscribe button and please make sure you give us a rating on whatever podcast app you listen to. We're there. And listen to Cal's show. It's Big Questions with Cal Fussman. It's great. I've already listened to probably close to a dozen episodes. There's a bunch of healthcare folks there. He mentioned Vivek, but he also had Andy Slavin and a few others. He has a really cool Shane's muscular dystrophy case on in his latest episode. So check out his show as well. Cal, thanks again. Everyone have a great day. Thank you for listening.